Good evening, everyone. I'd like to call the April 11th Planning Policy Commission meeting to order, and it currently is 6:32 p.m. Tonight's meeting is a hybrid meeting. Planning Policy Commission is in person, but staff or members of the public may be attending virtually or in person. Stephen, do we have a quorum this evening?
Chair Voice, yes, you have a quorum tonight, and Commissioner Kennedy has an excused absence.
Great, thank you. We're going to jump right into it. We're going to start with public comment this evening. Because we're having a public hearing in just a moment, this is for general public comments for the Planning Policy Commission. And staff, has anyone signed up to make general public comments this evening?
Chair Voice, there is no one in the room, and we do not have any virtual attendees.
Okay, thank you. We're going to move right along into our public hearing. And tonight, the public hearing is regarding proposed amendments to the Title 18 regarding the House Bill 1220, Emergency Shelters in Supportive Housing. I'll open the public hearing, which will be followed by a presentation from staff. Then the PPC will ask follow-up questions. Next, we will take public testimony. And then finally, the PPC will deliberate. And if we feel it appropriate, we will make a recommendation for the City Council. Kristen Leeson, our senior planner, will be presenting this evening. Now, Kristen, we want to wait to open the public hearing after your.
Correct. You want to wait to open the public comment period?
Okay.
Yes.
So when you're ready, go ahead.
Okay. Good evening. I'm Kristen Leeson, Senior Planner with the Long Range Planning Division. Yes, and as Chair Voice just mentioned, we are holding a public hearing tonight on the House Bill 1220 amendments to Title 18. If my computer decides to cooperate. There we go. So we'll hold a public hearing, and then afterwards you all will vote and make a recommendation to City Council if you feel it is appropriate, ready to do so. So as a reminder, that House Bill 1220 became effective in September 2021. It requires that all jurisdictions allow emergency shelters, which we're now calling day centers and night shelters, emergency housing, transitional housing, and permanent supportive housing within our jurisdiction. We can make reasonable occupancy, spacing, and intensity of use requirements, but they cannot be so restrictive that they prohibit these uses within our city. So I'm just going to start off. This one's different. I'm going to start off with some typos that I noticed in the packet, so you don't have to bring them up later. One is that day centers and night shelters, there is sort of a definition tacked on to the end of emergency housing, so I removed that. There is emergency housing, it says often includes and often includes, so I removed the second and often includes. 18-500-130 B dot requirements was left out, so it looks like the purpose is the requirements, which is not the case. And then there's one other one that I noted I put in here, but it's not here for some reason, and I will find it and let you know what that is as we're going through here. So the first changes that took place were really in the definitions. We talked about these at the March 28th meeting. And one was that we added a definition for chronically homeless, and we also added a definition for disability, which we did run by our human services folks, and they made a couple of little tweaks to it, but we're happy we were adding it. So chronically homeless, we talked about last time. It's kind of long, but it's an individual with a disability experiencing homelessness who lives in a place not meant for human habitation or has essentially been living homeless for 12 months or the equivalent of 12 months within a certain amount of time. An individual who has been residing in an institutional care facility for fewer than 90 days. That was where the mistake was, and I cleaned that one up. And 3, a family with an adult head of household who meets all of the criteria of this definition, including a family whose composition has fluctuated while the head of the household has been homeless. The next definition that we have is, I'm just going through the definitions now. Day center, night center, it provides temporary day, night, or 24/7 shelter for individuals or families, and it may provide access to essential facilities. The more complete definitions are there, but I don't want to read them all verbatim. Emergency housing is short-term indoor accommodations for individuals or family who are homeless or are at imminent risk of experiencing homelessness. They address the basic essential health, food, clothing, and personal hygiene needs. It often includes on-site case management, and it may require, as we've talked about, occupants to enter into a lease or occupancy agreement. Permanent supportive housing. Permanent housing, which housing assistance and supportive services are provided to assist households with at least one member with a disability in achieving housing stability. And transitional housing, it provides housing and supportive services to individuals or families experiencing homelessness or at imminent risk of becoming homeless for up to 2 years. So where can these be located? Now, really, this covers 18402, which is the table of permitted uses, but I'm doing it in picture format rather than table format because it's easier to see. So day centers and night shelters are required to be allowed where hotels are allowed. So this represents where they're allowed in all the zones listed in the legend in the bottom left. Transitional, permanent, supportive, and emergency housing are required to be allowed where housing is allowed and where hotels are allowed. So that is represented here in this map and in the legend. And again, this is represented in table format in 18402, which is the table of permitted uses. For residential use standards, the changes were based on conversation that we had with the Washington State Department of Commerce. One was that they said, do not limit density and occupancy to the point you cannot accommodate affordable housing targets. The difference here is that we were under the assumption, the way we read it, that you needed to just be able to accommodate these facilities. But they want you to be able to accommodate all 3,353 permanent supportive housing units for people. So by limiting these to 100 units within our zones that would just require FAR, where you can build more, that was too limiting. So we took that out. And then they also said with transitional housing, permanent supportive housing, and emergency housing, if you're going to include an operational plan, you either need to be very, very detailed, which our city attorney said, I prefer you not do that because it makes us liable, or just don't include it because, as we've talked about before, when you get funding, state and federal agencies will require that you include an operational plan there. So for I'm just going to say supportive housing, we remove the 100-person cap, as I mentioned, in zones that are regulated by FAR, floor area ratio, and we also remove the operational plan requirement. So right now, the requirements are the density or maximum number of residents. This is the one that I changed. The density or maximum number of residents is based on the development regulations of the underlying zoning district in which the use is proposed. Okay. So what we did with the day centers and night shelters under 18-500-130 is that we simply removed the half-mile requirement because the area, they're only allowed where hotels are allowed. The area is relatively small. So we removed the half-mile requirement, but we left the 50-person cap on there. So the requirements are, they're limited by development regulations under the underlying zoning district, but they can have a maximum of 50 occupants. And we still left the operational plan in this one, which is required to provide security and safety procedures, code of conduct expectations for residents, and community relations plan, including primary contact information, which has to be resubmitted annually or if there are significant changes in the plan. Yes? Right.
You want to get through your presentation?
Yeah, I'm almost done. So if you, okay. So for timeline, it's the public hearing, and then a PDE, the Planning, Development, and Environmental Commission, will make their hear this and make their recommendation to the Planning Policy Commission on May 1st, and then council action would take place either May 20th or June 3rd. And then the staff's administration's proposed recommendation is that you recommend approval of the proposed amendments to IMC 1802 definitions, 18402 table of permitted uses, and the additions of sections 18500-120 and 18500-130 to chapter 18500 residential use standards. And again, you all are going to deliberate and then make a recommendation to City Council if you feel it's appropriate. Now, I'm ready for questions.
All right, we'll start with clarifying questions. Again, we will deliberate after we take public testimony. So again, right now we are just doing questions. Commissioner Milligan.
Back to removing the half mile because it restricted capacity, if I understand that correctly. Okay. And is the Department of Commerce comment and being the reason for doing that a requirement? Does that say that you were not compliant with the law, or this is what was preferred?
When they asked us to look at the numbers that we're expected to accommodate, and when we went in with GIS and started doing the half mile, we weren't sure that that we could fit enough people in there.
Okay. And then my second clarifying question was, what was that number again, and where did it come from?
It came from the county.
The capacity of a number of people that we are expected to accommodate?
Right. It came from the county. And, it's like, I think the number is actually closer to 2,997 people that we need to accommodate at 80% and below. That's the number that we are looking at here. We thought it might just be the permanent supportive housing, which was still pretty high, but it's not. So it's all of it. Those are the numbers that were included that are also included in the comprehensive plan that they were given to us by the county.
Commissioner Kraus.
Hello. Can you go back? The one that we said you had to remove the cap because for some other reasons. Which scenario was that? Was
18500-120 under requirements.
I guess my question is, what do other cities do around this? Do they not have a cap either, or is this?
Well, here's the interesting thing. There are about 255 cities or jurisdictions that are supposed to do this. Only about 50 have submitted their plans, their regulations so far, and only 5, after they've relooked at them, really meet what the state wants to do. So a lot of people are going to have to go back and amend it. So I can't really answer that question. It's King County, I think Bellevue, Redmond, and 2 others, and Covington maybe. I don't recall what they do regarding caps. And Spokane. Not Wenatchee? Oh, excuse me. I think Wenatchee, not Covington. Okay, Wenatchee, not Covington.
Any further questions? Commissioner Patterson.
Commissioner Patterson, on this slide here, the removal of the operational plan requirement, I know in the memo it mentioned that that is a requirement when attached to state or federal funding. Is there any other scenario that we would not see an operational plan? Like, is there any risk or potential scenario where an operational plan would not be required somewhere before the point where they're building these facilities in our city? So
I'm going to speak, but then allow my friend to speak as well, Commissioner Altamore. But my understanding, so they're attached to it if they receive state or federal funding, and oftentimes local funding, such as ARCH. If they don't receive funding and they build this on their own, then they would not be required to do an operational plan. I am not aware of any, however, that have not been built without funding.
Would an example be like a religious institution? They put the funds up themselves?
They could, if they had the funding. I mean, they're expensive, and this is me speaking in theory, and I shouldn't do that. But I know that the one built in Kirkland, the one built over at the Lutheran Church in Bellevue, Those have all required funding.
Commissioner Altamore.
So what you said is absolutely true. What you might be describing, Chair, is something like Union Gospel Mission, where they don't take any public funds and they do require religious participation, but it's still a big operating business. There's still money that comes in, and so it's almost impossible to do any sort of business without some sort of plan. It's just that only their funders are verifying that plan versus various public funders that might be doing that, or private foundations or something like that.
The opportunity. Yeah, Commissioner Altamore, please.
I just wanted to make one other clarification, and that is on the county targets, that the 80% AMI and below, am I correct in saying that that's on affordable housing, not necessarily housing that is dedicated toward people experiencing homelessness or some sort of emergency?
You are, but when I asked them, I said, who, when we are looking at this and who are we gearing, who are we making sure that we have this for, when we were talking about 1220, they said everybody at 80% and below. I know.
So that 3,000 number is actually including a lot of affordable housing units having us for our potential target. Am I hearing that
Right. But even if we look just at the PSH, permanent supportive housing numbers, those are still close to 2,000, I believe. It's high. Maybe it's 1,500, but it's high. 800, yeah. I have my library over here. 50% and 50%. So everything at 50% and below, they're 2,500. So
Big chunk.
yeah, it's a big number.
Please. This is time for
So again,
questions.
this is a codified requirement that we have the capacity, like our building capacity for growth management target. This is a requirement, or this is a desire of the Department of Commerce to have enough capacity within the regulations to serve 1,000
So
people.
House Bill 1220 requires that we accommodate enough for all affordable housing. It also requires that we allow these different facilities under here. So it's a little bit of both. We need to require both. And then the target numbers come from our state mandated housing target. So our state mandated housing target is 3,500 new housing units by 2044. From that, they said 2,997 of these need to be at or below 80% of AMI. And of those, about 2,500 need to be at or below 50%. Does that answer your question? So it is mandated.
Yeah, but it doesn't say that the at or below 50% is equal to the number of people who need permanent transitional and permanent supportive housing.
Correct.
Commissioner Bader.
Yeah, I'll try to frame. I don't know if this is helpful. Listening to this, I wonder if that's, is that a question word? I wonder if that's as kind of like a preventative measure, right? And so if you're looking at a low, like 80 or below or 50 or below AMI, is that to like have a place for folks who might be like one missed paycheck away, right, from experiencing homelessness? And does it give us capacity for that? That's some of the logic behind that bigger number.
So it includes those who are close to being homeless.
Right.
Or, yeah.
Yeah.
So it does.
Commissioner Samota.
Yeah, if you could just remind us what the AMI is, like the actual dollar value.
Yes. It is actually about, I think it is 134,600. It's close to that.
Okay.
Yeah,
No,
that's about what it
that's
is.
the
For the
exact-
80% for a family of 4 is what that is.
Okay.
That's around 134,000.
Okay, and then we're looking at 80% of that, and then a certain amount, 50% and below of that as well,
Correct.
for that 2,900 and that 2,500. Okay, just to get a sense of what population that would be affected.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Any further questions? I had just one question, Kristen, which was, can you go back to that floor area ratio slide? A little bit more about like residential areas, how that would look.
Sure. Sure. So in zones like multifamily high, you are allowed a maximum of 29 dwelling units per acre. And in single family suburban, you're allowed 4.5 dwelling units per acre. So those zones and several others have very specific maximums on what can be built per acre. Our zones like mixed use, central Issaquah, urban core, village residential, those do not have maximums. Those you can just, they don't have maximums on units. They have maximums on the building square footage, essentially, so the height and the envelope. And you can fit as many units in there as you want to. It's about the outside of the building. So that's when we say we put a 100 person cap on facilities in these zones. That was so that, you know, you wouldn't potentially have 1,500 people located in one building. Not likely to happen, but you know. But they have asked us to remove that so that we can ensure that we can accommodate all these people. And then, you know, another point that they stated, Commerce, when we were talking with them, we said one of our reasons for doing that was because you don't want everyone in one location. You know, you want affordable housing to be dispersed throughout the city. And they said maybe so with affordable housing, but when it's, you know, permanent, when it's transitional or, you know, emergency housing, that kind of thing, you really do want it to be, often closer to transit and closer to medical facilities and everyone to be close to these facilities so that they can use them.
Yeah, and that
So,
makes
no,
perfect
good
sense.
point.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, no, I appreciate the
Okay.
explanation. But the idea, and I know you said it, but I'll just say it. And they go above allotted land use numbers, certain zones. So again, it's not that we're building huge buildings in somebody's quiet suburban
Oh,
neighborhood.
no.
They can still build the supportive housing, but all of these.
Correct.
So, okay. Appreciate it. Going once, going twice. Vice Chair Bader.
Yeah, this is an easy question, a language question. So in the day center night shelter definition, day center night shelter means a facility, da-da-da-da-da, and then the second sentence in that goes back to using the emergency shelters language. Okay.
Good catch. I'll change that. Thank you.
I didn't know if that was like had to be in there so the state knew what we meant by.
No.
Actually, I just noticed too, disability means any individual. My contribution.
All right, well, Kristen's making a note of that. Are there any further questions before we back to public comment portion? Seeing as there's no more questions, we will open the public comment portion at 6:56 p.m. Stephen, has anyone signed up to speak?
Chair Voice, there are no virtual attendees and no one signed up in the room for public comment.
Okay. We'll close the public comment at 6 p.m. Okay, that being said, there is a formal action requested on this agenda, so we do need to make a motion in order to debate. Somebody be willing to pick us off and make a motion. Vice Chair Bader.
I move to recommend approval of the proposed amendments to IMC 8.102 definitions, IMC 18.402 table of permitted uses, and the additions of sections 8.500.120 and 18.500.130 to chapter 18.500 residential use standards.
Great, thank you, Vice Chair Bader. Is there a second?
Second.
Right. Vice Chair Bader did make the motion, so we will start with you if you'd like to speak. We'll just kick it off that way. Everyone will have the opportunity to speak out, but start with Vice Chair. Like right now.
No pressure. No, I think that there's obviously been a lot of discussion and back and forth, and I think that where this has landed does a nice job of balancing what we have to do according to the state with like managing risk to the city and serving, you know, individuals who might need these services. And so all in all, I'm actually in support of where this landed. Don't have a whole lot to comment on that right now until I hear what everybody else has.
All right, we can do this a few different ways. I can either look for hands or we'll just do a round robin, but I definitely like to hear, unless you really have nothing you'd like to say, but I'd love to hear from all of you. All right, Commissioner Milligan.
Commissioner Milligan here. Thank you, and thank you, Vice Chair Bader, for your opening comments. I think that I'd be surprised if nobody agreed with you on that, because everybody wants to be able to provide for the people in our community who are in need, and it's great to have definitions about it so that we have some structure for it. And I'm really glad to be making progress in that. There are just a couple things that I would disagree with, and I'm going to just point on one right now and see if somebody else picks up the other one by osmosis. The one is the operational plan, and we include in this draft the operational plan requirement for day and night shelters, and just correct me when I go wrong, but we have removed it from permanent supportive housing, additional housing, and emergency housing based on the recommendation from Commerce and the advice to tread carefully if you do include it from our legal counsel. And when you look at the definition under day and night shelter, considering the legal advice, it seems that this would be treading in a reliably legal way. The operational plan, for those who aren't reading it right now like I am, includes that the operational plan needs to include safety and security procedures, code of conduct expectations for residents, community relations plan, including primary contact information. Not a lot controversial there. Now, indeed, there could be something controversial in one of those, like in the code of conduct, but this operational plan needs to be approved by the city every year, where legal counsel could chime in and say we can't defend that. So I want to propose, and if I'm hearing any resonance in this, I would be the one who put up an amendment to say to include back in permanent supportive housing and transitional housing and emergency housing the requirement of just the same as we have in the other.
Thank you, Commissioner Milligan. Would anyone like to pick up that thread or start a new thread? Commissioner Krass.
So I think having rules makes lots of sense, and when you said them, those are very straightforward. It's just saying you need to have some of these rules. So I totally agree. And I really want to know why they would say that causes problems, or we just accept that. So I agree with you on that.
Just from the presentation, it sounds like more of a liability thing, but Commissioner Zapata?
This may be a clarifying question. I know we're a little bit beyond that. I guess the question is for the operational plans. They're not per se required if it's not public funded. Is that a correct statement?
That's correct.
Okay, so what we're proposing, or what's being proposed, is to require it regardless of public funding or private funding.
Right, but I do need to clarify, it's not required by the city,
Okay.
but they're likely required by the organization running the facility.
Mm-hmm.
And
Okay.
every business has a plan, if they're good.
And then I guess another question, I'm taking up all this time, do we have data that shows like how many of these facilities do have operational plans and how they work, as opposed to how facilities that don't have them, how they operate as it pertains to security and safety?
No, we don't have any in the city, and we have not researched it. However, Commissioner Altamore may have a better idea.
And I guess where I'm going is to see if there's been any incidents where something's happened and then it's been found out that there was an operational plan or that there wasn't an operational plan.
I'm not,
Okay.
I'm not aware of any.
Okay, thank
Yeah.
you.
Commissioner Altamore.
I don't know of any that exist that don't have an operational. And incidents happen or don't happen, how well those are implemented.
Commissioner Patterson, you-
Yeah, I'm trying to noodle on this operational plan topic. I recall from previous meetings, we kind of discussed that ultimately it's like a checkbox scenario for the city anyway, where, you know, they could essentially hand in a piece of paper with crayon drawings to say security plan and like, you know, give it to us. Obviously that's hypothetical and hyperbolic, but ultimately the idea that we would hold them to a certain standard beyond just checking the box doesn't really exist from what I've understood. Like it's truly just submit your plan, make sure that you've done it, and then it's good to go. So I guess where I'm kind of going with it is like, even if we required it across the board that they have to submit it, it's kind of a red herring. Like it's just checking another box. It's just saying that we have it, but we're not really holding them to a lot of accountability besides just saying that we have their operational plan. So I'm kind of, I guess, on the understanding of like why we wouldn't include it in the current amendment, the way it's been proposed, if it's not really holding any water with our decision making or like how we would move forward with it, I guess. So I kind of understand where we landed, I think, and that's why I don't have a very strong opinion about reintroducing it, I guess.
Commissioner Krass?
So on that one, I guess the question comes down to mitigation, meaning they turn in a plan. The city says, wow, you're doing nothing. Then what happens? Then does the city have the right? Sorry, water. Does the city have the right to say, there's, you need to either do this or you no longer have a license to operate this? I'm not, so maybe the pushback was about the mitigation of what do you do if they submit one and they don't follow it. Oh, wow. I know. So was the question about if they did have a plan and they didn't follow it, what does the city do? I'm just trying to understand
So
where the teeth are.
inside the facility is one thing, but the city has, oftentimes mitigation plans, or not mitigation plans, operational plans will include trash cleanup, right? That they're required to have so many trash cans on the property where people can dispose of their trash. The city has laws, and we have code enforcement officers who can also enforce those things. If there's, heaven forbid, a shooting somewhere or a fight that breaks out, that's against the law, and the police can be called. So there are other measures in place that the city has to enforce law breaking or breaking code. So there are other things in place to manage that.
Just real quickly, I know, and tell me if I'm wrong, Motel 6, that currently has an operation. That's, city's using that as, the reason I bring it up, there was an incident. You're right, to your point, what happened was against the law. So again, I'm kind of agreeing. I can see why our city attorney would basically say, unless you have an extreme amount of specificity, we'd be liable, which I tend to side with the attorney. I understand my colleagues' concerns, but just to use Motel 6, and that would have been something with an operational anyway, correct? And I think I follow. I'm using as an example, like one thing
They do have one,
Okay.
yeah.
And
But I haven't looked at it, but they have one.
Right, and that didn't stop what happened.
Right.
The police.
Right.
So, Commissioner Samota.
Yeah, and then that's kind of how I see it as well, because if the operational plan isn't any more stringent than what the laws already provide, then it almost becomes more of a restriction for a developer to actually produce one of those facilities. And it becomes that checklist per se. And then the other aspect is that who's going to be adjudicating it, in the sense like who's going to be reviewing those operational plans as well, and then enforcing it as well. Like, what's the difference between that adjudicator looking at this operational plan as opposed to another one? What is the litmus test on that?
Are we debating?
Yeah, I
Okay.
think
So
this really
I guess it comes down to
Commissioner Kraft.
the scenario. You have operation that has a plan, has not done anything to make sure that it's being followed. It gives teeth to have their capabilities revoked. Just gives you the opportunity to come in there if you have something that's set. And you probably don't look at them until there's an issue, to be honest. You're not going to be managing and looking at everyone's. But it gives whether it's the city or county or whoever, the ability to say, you know what? Business A, you have not been following the plan that you submitted. You have a certain amount of time to turn this around. If you don't have a license to be able to do that. It just gives the ability, I would think, as a stick to keep people the right way.
Commissioner Osborne.
This, I think, a question for staff along those lines. So our role in this is just where something is allowed to be built, correct?
Correct.
Right. So if it's built and it's operating, that doesn't fall under the code. And so that would fall under another place, another department in the city, not what we're talking about here.
So if they build something but then don't manage it, then it's we did our part and someone else has to figure out? Is that how it works?
This department, yeah.
Okay.
So for instance, if they also got funding through the Human Services Department, then Human Services would audit them annually or usually every 3 years and determine whether or not they're meeting that, and then they would pull the funding if they're not. There are very few programs that are actually licensed. There are some that are accredited, but there isn't really a licensing to.
That was helpful. So kind of the funding is if you're becoming a bad actor, that dries up, and that's what will keep you
Yes.
on the straight and narrow.
Yes.
To do it right. Okay.
Yes.
That makes sense. Thanks.
Commissioner Milligan.
Excellent conversation. So, and I find it all very compelling. There's an operational requirement for day centers and night shelters, though. And if this is just a use table decision on if the use is allowed, why are operational plans required there and not in the other? Is that, what do I need? Should I ask that question? Would it be helpful, Kristen?
You can, and this really is about, the code says allow them, period. That's what they say. And we initially put it in there because after looking at so many other codes, they had included operational plans. Our city attorney said, don't include so much information, reduce it. The state said, don't include it at all for emergency, permanent, supportive, and transitional housing because funders will require that. But do include it in these. So maybe, I'm not quite sure where else in the code it would go, perhaps, you know, some other chapter or title in the code, I'm not sure where it would go, but this is where we've seen it in other plans.
Absolutely.
Okay, I'm going to propose an amendment, which doesn't mean we're not done talking. That just means we know what we're talking about. So I'm still, and this has been a great conversation, and I don't disagree with anything anybody has said here. I agree with everyone. I just love this. But the fact that it would be covered, or you would assume it would be covered, something that you desire to have because of a funding source, doesn't seem like that's compelling enough for me. And also, I'm looking at, as I said before, this code and these arrangements with the city to be successful. And if this helps, and if funding sources require operational plans because that makes these facilities more successful, then why don't we? So I'm going to propose an amendment. I amend the original motion to have included the language about a requirement for an operational plan to be applied to permanent supportive housing, transitional housing, and emergency housing in the same way that it is applied to day center and night shelter.
Is there a second? Commissioner Trask seconds it.
We get more chance to talk. And I'm just going to say that it is giving the city an opportunity to say, we care about having these things, we care that they're successful. We're giving the people who run them a little more support and structure in order to have a successful service provider. And that would be, and also I think that because these facilities, these housing facilities may come up against public pushback, that the more reassurances that are there may prevent some of that pushback.
That have to be a new amendment? That was a pretty big add-on. That have to be it.
No, that was my
Expert. Fair enough. Is there any more discussion about the amendment that's been put? Commissioner Samweta.
Yeah. When we say operational plan, is there a template? And because we can say add an operational plan as a requirement, but what is that? And who would actually set that template? Would it be this commission here, or would it be Human Services? Who would actually put together the requirements of that operational plan so that somebody who is receiving it, that it's submitted to, they'd be able to actually review it?
So the operational plan would be required, the template comes from the funders, not from the city.
Okay. So it's still putting it back into the funder's hands.
Correct.
So it would just be, I'm not seeing the benefit, or because if the funder's going to do it, they're going to do it on their own accord, as opposed to being required to do it. So that's kind of where I'm not in support of it, but if we are saying it may move forward as an amendment, I would say that it probably needs more definition on what it is. Otherwise, it's essentially just that checklist. Please include this.
Commissioner Trask.
So if I hear this right, I think all we're saying is you need to have an operational plan that would cover these thematic things like safety, blah, 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 like these three things that you mentioned earlier. And the reason why I like having this, and also it's kind of hearsay of why they didn't like it, because I don't have enough information to really understand their pushback. But I think by having that, it keeps us from just passing the buck. Someone else will pick this up, and maybe they'll do that. It just says, hey, the city cares about this. You got to have this, and sure, you'll have more requirements, more specific ones from your funders. But it would seem weird to have it in some and not the other, and why would we? So that's why I'm behind.
Vice Chair Bader.
Yeah, like really see the risk to the city. And as I'm listening to this, my like question is, does the city have like expertise who would be able to say, hey, this is a good plan, right? This has the things that we want. Is that even like a person that exists in the city? Or does it need to be shopped around all of the different departments who might do like the enforcement, right? If a law is broken or.
So the operational plans that are used right now have been in place for a while, have been amended to make sure if something's not working, then they amend them to make sure they work. And this isn't me speaking on behalf, this is just the way things work. If it's not working, you fix it. So they've been around for a while. If somebody in the city were going to review it to determine whether or not it's a good plan, they would likely have to go to Human Services, who does this. They would go to the fire department, for East Side Fire and Rescue, for their approval. We go to the police department for their approval. But we've talked about perhaps the police getting a copy of it, but it's been vetted. So, the city could be there, but again, we have our code enforcement officers so there's nobody to say this is a good plan or not, right. I think. But, unless you send it to those people and say, yeah, based on our experience in the police department, that works. Yeah. Based on our fire expert, it would be divided up to determine whether it's a good plan. But like I said, these have been vetted. So
yeah, because I think what we're talking about is kind of putting the onus on the city to say this is a good plan, right? And then
We're putting the onus just to say there is a plan.
But then what does it matter? Because it could be a really bad one, and they have one, then great, right?
The requirement would only be the same as it is for day center and night shelters, very general categories of topics that would reassure the success of the facility. In my mind, that's what I think those things do. And the enforcement of it is on the facility. And the details of it, as Commissioner Kraft said, could come from a funder. I think, wait, I said that the funder could be providing more details, and then some issues of enforcement through funding reapplications. Yeah, so but the city would only be saying, this is the expectation we have for this unique use in the city.
And I understand the desire to have one of these, but I'm not questioning, the need to have these businesses operate safely and successfully. I guess if it is just a tick the box, it feels like there's enough checks and balances there, be it from the funders, be it from other ways to enforce things throughout the city, that what does this really serve for these uses?
We're going to have Stephen pop in here real quick.
Chair Voice, thank you. So Stephen Perdue, Long Range Planning Manager. If I could just chime in really quick on this topic. So Vice Chair Bader is actually bringing up the exact point of the liability component of all of this. How it is written into the proposed code or proposed draft amendments is exactly checking the box of we are showing the existence of the plans. But because we are requiring it as part of our code, that then adds to the liability for incidents that might happen with these type of facilities. Despite the fact that we're only requiring its existence, not exactly saying whether it's a good or bad plan, we still have that liability based on anything that might happen on those facilities. So that is the worry from Department of Commerce as well as a city attorney, which is why we don't want to have too much detail, but also proposing of not having the information be required. And there's only very specific topics to be required, not exact details of how that needs to be addressed in those operational plans.
Let me add, I know Commissioner Altamore has been waiting patiently.
Okay. I just had a quick question. I'm sorry. Then how come we didn't pull it from the other category? We left it in some, but not in the others. So I'm curious why that's not a liability
then. In response to the Department of Commerce, specifically on the permanent supportive housing, transitional housing, and emergency housing. And that comment wasn't made for day centers, night shelters. And so that was part of the discussion we want to have with the commission was, should we be keeping that language for day centers, night shelters?
Commissioner Altamore.
Thank you. So it's an interesting conversation, and as we think about who might be coming in for a program like this. So if I'm coming in and I want to do a youth shelter that has 8 bedrooms, and I then have to go through the state to make sure that I meet all of the compliance, that I'm meeting all of the expectations for a youth shelter. If I want to have a 20-unit facility that meets the code or is in the downtown and meets the FAR requirements, then if I am putting that in, and it's for adults, and there isn't that same state requirement, if I didn't have an operational plan, or if the operational plan said security, lock the door at night, code of conduct, don't spit on the floor, and that's the plan, could the city really stop me from opening that, from building there if I've met all of the other requirements of the city? And so I absolutely get what you are asking for and why you're asking for it, but when you mentioned pass the buck, this is what really sort of stood out for me. We are one piece of the puzzle of an entire bunch of city departments that come together for a facility to be built or to be opened when you've renovated another facility. And so I don't see the operational plan being a part of our piece of the puzzle. Our piece of the puzzle is where can things go and what are the requirements have to be for them to be there. So that's my take. And the reality is that unless I am a good-hearted soul who wants to do this for lovely reasons and am consulting no one, or I'm a bad-hearted soul and want to do this for terrible reasons and am consulting no one, you're going to have a plan. You can't open something like this. It's a complicated business to run without that. So I just think that it's a little bit of overkill for it to be in here.
Anyone like to?
Chair Boyce,
Commissioner
I'm
Milligan.
hoping to end the conversation so we can go to a vote by
Right.
saying, you know, I could go with, let's add the operational plan requirement, as I did in the amendment to the permanent supportive transitional and emergency housing, or remove it from the nice center. I could have, we could have gone either way. I chose to say, let's add it because I thought it was a good idea, that it was an additional quality, that the argument for removing it was not compelling to me, and that it isn't very specific, it isn't very restrictive. I felt it would increase confidence in the facilities by the public. And if anybody has anything else to say, please do, but I'm willing to move to a vote myself.
Any further debate? All right, we will take a vote. So all those in favor of Commissioner Milligan's amendment, please say aye. Right, the amendment fails. Now we will.
Thank you for the discussion.
Yeah, a great discussion. So we will now move on to our original topic. So we'll come back to our debate as far as what we were talking about is, so the whole thing, definitions, everything. Pick it up. Is there any debate? Commissioner Altamore.
This isn't necessarily debate, just a comment that I want to make, and that is that it's kind of a shame to me that Commerce conflated all affordable housing with housing that needs services attached to it because of the specific needs of the residents that are there, because they are very different animals. And the reality is that even most individuals who, or families or whoever it might be, who fall into homelessness often need a short-term set of services, and then they're just living like a normal neighbor. And so conflating those seems to me building some rhetoric that's not necessary. So I would love for us, as we talk about it, to separate those two as much as possible, because housing where services are really needed and necessary for the success are very different than housing that's affordable to any neighbor.
Is there any further debate? Original amendment. Commissioner Altamore.
No. Commissioner Altamore? Commissioner Milligan? Okay.
Commissioner Milligan.
How deep is this motion going? Is this going into the other land use changes? The other, or just the permanent supportive and emergency? I'm looking at past the use table at other things in the comp plan amendment. Is that in this motion too?
So
There's a
the-
bunch of chapter numbers in there. And I just,
There's, in your memo, there's a recommended motion, but it's just for the Title 18, a motion, House Bill 1220 recommendations that you've talked about. So the definitions, the permitted uses table, and
Just-
the requirements for
yeah,
each.
thank you.
Any further comment? All right, I'll wrap it up. I just wanted to say thank you to everyone for a great debate, conversation. I also wanted to say a very special thank you to our senior planner, Ethan, as well as Commissioner Altamore for being a vast amount of knowledge on this topic. I'll be honest, I was one of those people myself who was very concerned at the beginning of this, and Vice Chair Bader as well. Pointed out to me that, again, it's important not to conflate worst things. We want to try to think of success stories, and hopefully that's what we're all looking for, is this to be a success. Regardless, it's going to be a requirement, and hopefully the city can get behind it, make our emergency shelters, all these, the best in the region. That's my hope. And I got a great education from all of you, and I appreciate it. I think that's really all I had to say. Great debate on the amendment. Appreciate discussion about that as well. Appreciate comments from staff and Stephen and Kristen shed some light about all of these issues. Right, we'll take a vote. Original motion. Do I have to say it again, Kristen?
It helps just to be
Oh,
sure we know
man.
what we're talking about.
Okay. Let me find it 1 second. So the original motion was to an approval of the proposed amendments to IMC 18.102 definitions, IMC 18.402 table of permitted uses, and the additions of sections 18.500.120 and 18.500.130 to chapter 18.500 residential use standards. Whole lot of numbers. You don't know how much this terrifies me. It's like the only part that makes me shake. So again, that is the motion on the floor. Let's go ahead and vote on it. All of those in favor of the motion passing for our recommendation for approval for city council, say aye. Aye. That's unanimous. Ayes have it. And I do want to make a note that we did have one commissioner absent, so our alternate also participated. Okay. Again, thank you, Senior Planner Leeson. We have 2 items under regular business tonight. We have 2 items under regular business. First is a follow-up discussion on public agency comment and proposed policies for the comprehensive plan. Land use element is part of the city's periodic update. Kristen Leeson, our senior planner, will be presenting again. So, Kristen, when you're ready, go ahead.
All right, I'm back. So yes, we received, as you know, we sent out our draft land use element to Commerce and to Puget Sound Regional Council. And we received comments back. We also sent it out to different tribes and different agencies that the state requires us to send those to. So we only received comments back from two groups. We received one comment from Puget Sound Regional Council, and we received several comments from the Snoqualmie tribe. So we're just going to go over some of those comments. I'm only showing you all the ones where we made changes. Also, though, this is the first time that you guys have seen the land use element with the vision and the discussions included as well. So I would like to also get your feedback, particularly on the vision, but if you have other things in regards to the discussions, we can talk about that. So again, review and provide feedback on the second round of draft amendments. Direction needed. Do you agree with the changes that were made? Were there other agency comments not addressed by staff that you feel like we need to address? And are there any changes that you would like to see to the introduction, vision, or the discussion? So just as a reminder, here's the vision. I'll read it. Issaquah's land use practices will advance sustainable land development to preserve a high-quality natural environment by directing development away from environmentally critical areas. It will encourage densities, and mixes of uses that create complete neighborhoods, maximize equity and inclusion, and enable all mobility options. On to the comments. First comment, and these are all from Snoqualmie tribe, was change compelling to directing for stronger language, and we did that. Maintain a high quality and natural environment by directing development away from environmentally critical areas. Natural environment discussion. Restructure the paragraphs so that the city isn't only framing the natural environment in terms of human gains, but the city has a responsibility to protect the natural environment. It's not just for us to play in. So it's important to be responsible stewards to preserve and conserve the natural resources. Okay. One, there was a typo, so we fixed that. It was, we used both implement and allow. We fixed that. And they asked us to consider removing to protect the property rights of landowners with critical areas. It says unnecessary and highlights only human-centered natural resource uses, and consider the inclusion of cultural resource protection. So as I said, we fixed the typo. We took out to protect the property rights of landowners, because that is specifically what they were speaking to, and added at the end as an incentive for protecting forested hillsides and cultural resources. So I think those changes addressed it. Please add in an ecologically sustainable way. So we did encourage a development of new community gathering spaces in an ecologically sustainable way. Same thing with land use and sustainability policy H2. Encourage development of amenity services and facilities that are supportive of neighborhood residents through investment incentives and development regulations in an ecologically sustainable way. Please add in an ecologically sustainable way, but also best management practices should also reference traditional ecological knowledge. So we added that at the top. Such agricultural uses shall use best management practices and traditional ecological knowledge to protect water quality, etc. This was a comment in specifically to resource lands in general. We made the change in policy J2. So consider referencing conservancy lands in the context of natural resource preservation and include the protection of cultural resources. So we included that here by including both of those, conservancy lands and cultural resources. This is the last one, comments, regional coordination and annexation. They just asked us to ask for meaningful consultation, which means, let's include the tribes in this discussion. So we included them as well, indigenous tribes. So this is the second time you've seen it. You will see the entire comp plan again in July. The public hearing will be in Q4, and council action will also be later in Q4 in December. So back to the direction needed. There we go. Do you agree with changes made? Are there comments that were made that we didn't address that we should? And are there any changes that you'd like to see in the introduction, vision, or discussion?
Thank you, Senior Planner Leeson. Commissioner, any questions? Or comments? Commissioner Altamore.
Is Traditional ecological knowledge, is that a thing? Is that a known phrase?
I don't know that it's a known phrase, traditional ecological knowledge, but it's referring to how the tribes, even wants to speak, but how the tribes have, go ahead. How the tribes have managed things and lived cohesively or together with, the water and the animals and the resources and how they always, so how they've continued to do that through their existence here.
Okay, thank you.
Does that definition need to be added to our definition?
We can try, sure. Yeah, we could do that.
Well, Commissioner Altimer's point.
Yeah.
Very broad.
We could, and we could expand on we could expand on that a little bit more too. Probably not add a definition, but just expand on what that means.
Commissioner Kraft?
It was one of the earlier ones, just for clarity, the thing that was struck about the property owner's rights. What was the context of that one? That was earlier.
Right there.
To protect the property rights of landowners. What's the context?
They just wanted to be sure that we're not so focused on how it affects the human, but rather on how it affects our environment, and hopefully doesn't affect our environment.
I don't see why they're in conflict. That was one of the notes that I have. Why do we have to take out property rights? I mean, we could still add what they wanted, but I mean, to me, some of this is human-centric. Obviously, these people live here.
Right, and there are, if somebody wants to build a house on their property, they have the right to build a house on their property. And if it is there are variances. If it looks undevelopable, there is a variance you can get to still find a way to build a house on that property. So there are plenty of property rights out there. I think they just didn't want it emphasized in this context.
Commissioner Milligan?
This isn't my planned comment, but does this have a little bit of something to do with the Bergsma property and how because we're talking about the transfer of development rights with critical areas, and how that, because we allowed that sort of thing to protect the property rights of owners with critical areas, was creating something that the city didn't really want, and then they didn't know what to do, because there it was allowed to transfer to protect property rights. It creates a circular issue, right?
So this particular policy and this request does not have anything to do with Bergsma.
Any of our commissioners that haven't spoken would like to speak? Vice Chair Bader? Yeah. Vice Chair Bader.
I'm just going to yield the floor. A comment on the vision, and I don't know how to word this comment. That I remember when we were having the Title 18 discussions, we kind of all felt like we pushed really, really hard on the environment and maybe not so hard on some other areas that are equally as important in the city, and this reads the same way to me. And so I don't have like a concrete suggestion of like language, but it leads really, really strong with the environment, and then it kind of like everything else is lumped in that second section. And I'm not saying we shouldn't emphasize the environment, it just feels like maybe the balance is there's a way to like and it instead of fine or.
Great comment. Commissioner Patterson.
Thank you, Chair. Also, one bit of feedback on the vision. I wish Commissioner Kennedy was here because she's great at this, but I get a little bit tripped up by it will encourage densities and mixes of uses. I don't have a fix for it, but I'm wondering if there's an opportunity to fine tune that a little bit. I don't know if anyone else agrees or has feedback or ideas on that, but that would be my feedback on that.
Fine tune in what direction?
Great question. I think it will encourage densities and mixes of uses. I don't know. Let me think on that a little bit more. But I think for me, I had to focus on what I was reading there a little bit more than the rest of the vision. But I can't really put a pin in it. So
More clarity than content.
Yeah, maybe, or just I think it's just words like mixed uses instead of mixes of uses. Like it could be as simple as that.
Okay.
But yeah, I'll let you know if I think of something better. But that was just kind of, I got stuck on that part.
So it's not necessarily that you don't want to encourage densities and mixes of uses, it's just the way that it's worded, it's a little hard
Yeah.
to read. Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Samota?
And then one thing I just saw here is the earlier part of that, it will encourage. Basically, we see quality natural environment by direct and development. That's very direct, and it's pushing us in a direction. Whereas that second piece, to Vice Chair Botter's point, it's not as strong as the first piece when you say it will encourage. So I don't know a synonym or the right word, but I think there needs to be a stronger word than encourage there.
Yeah,
So,
one's very implementable, one's sort of,
yes,
maybe do this. Okay.
exactly.
Commissioner Kraft?
I guess it also comes down to the role of the city. The role of the city is to protect some things, and that's why it's a strong word at the beginning. But we're not in the business of building stuff, so I think I was okay with the way that was, like, that one's strong, you gotta protect and you gotta be there. And then you wanna make sure you have the right things in place to get the outcomes that you want, but you're not responsible for doing those, so I think encourage. I mean, I felt pretty good with that, and I would think that was a good balance, what the role of the city would be. I'm not sure if that was the intent going in.
Both great comments. Commissioner Samota?
Yeah, just to clarify on that, because there's protecting the environment, but there's also the protection of, like, when you look at equity and inclusion as well. So that's where you also have to have a little bit more direct language as well on that end. And that's just the only statement I'll make on that. I do agree, okay, mobility, complete neighborhoods, but the piece on, I guess you say maximize equity and inclusion, that's something that has to be intentional on.
Maybe here's some wording I don't normally do in these meetings. Fostering, maybe, in that realm, instead of encourage. I don't know, it's something,
Foster's more, I guess, sounds like it's more of like an active word.
I don't know, just
That is part of what we do, wordsmith.
Yeah.
Commissioner Milligan?
I'll take the bait. Let's remove the words densities and mixes of uses that create. Because it is specified in the land use code elsewhere. This is just the vision. This is such a long vision. I mean, poor Kristen had to read this whole thing. If it says, because complete neighborhood has densities and mixes of uses. If it didn't have mixes of uses, it wouldn't be a complete neighborhood. Or maybe we need to define a complete neighborhood and say somewhere else that it has densities and mixes of uses. But in the vision statement, if you went straight from it will foster, or some stronger word, complete neighborhoods and maximize equity and inclusion and enable them, I bet you would get what you wanted. Commissioner. I think that's what, yeah.
Nice segue. Commissioner Patterson? Commissioner Altamore?
I just have a really ridiculous question to follow up. So if you took out from encourage to create, is it or is it they? Will. Because it's land use practices. Sorry, I'm not trying to wordsmith that deeply, but I'm just trying to make it make sense in my brain because I really like what you suggested. No, we definitely
But-
need Carolyn for the fine tuning.
I think it's they, because up above it says land use, Issaquah's land use practices will, and it's not it, it's they. So I think it's they.
Then if it were, they will create complete neighborhoods, maximize equity and inclusion.
That sounds
Can
pretty
I-
good. Yeah, Vice
Can I-
Chair.
can I, like, rather than delete, do we flip? Because I worry that complete neighborhoods is like really up for interpretation. And so, it will create complete neighborhoods that include, a variety of densities and mixes of uses.
Commissioner Milligan.
I want to get back on the definition thing. What was your word, Commissioner Altamore, that you wanted to define? Which one was it? Does anybody remember?
Yeah, traditional
Traditional
ecological
practices, yeah.
practices.
And I would like to have that defined also. I was really excited about having that included, those, because the other phrase in there, the best practices or whatever the other one is, has misguided some land uses in ways, in my opinion. So I'm glad to have something counterbalance that strong opinion. There are a couple other places where I thought we should have definitions. One is cultural resources.
So we're actually taking definitions out of the comprehensive plan this year, because what happens is that they are often in conflict with what's in the land use code. And if something changes, so what we'll try and do is to spell them out a little more clearly in the policies rather than define them.
Okay, whatever gets to the same purpose. And then the other one was, I detected, and I'm sorry that I didn't inventory, an inconsistent reference to our tribal community members. And it's especially noticed, the application of it in Land Use Policy K4, where it's work with King County and Indigenous tribes, that's capitalized. So I thought, is that defined somewhere? And then, and it might be defined at the state level for all I know, yeah. So that's good, and it's in all caps. And so then I was going to say, check with the rest of the document to see that if we have strong language like that, which is trying to be, identify who needs to be called, who you need to call, that we know clearly who they are, and that somebody who's not getting called doesn't say, hey, how come you didn't call me? So those are all my definitions. I still have one more comment after that.
Commissioner Milligan.
Okay, senior planner Leeson, I'm looking at land use policy, what was B6, I think, about wildlife corridors. And I want to know why that was removed. I always thought that was a really strong, strong application of our environmental ethics. And it's consistent with what the tribe said about the land is not just for us.
So several of our wildlife corridors policies were moved to the environmental element. And that's why. So they're still there. They're just in a different element.
Give it a moment. Any further feedback? All right. Yeah, I second a lot of what everybody said. And I do appreciate Vice Chair Bader's comment about the vision. I don't know if there's a way to wordsmith it a little bit. Actually, it is land use. You know, we do focus a lot on the environment. Clearly we do. But it seems kind of important to also mention those neighborhoods. And maybe with the wordsmithing, maybe we have it. So just, but anyway, keep it in mind. That was all I had to repeat. Any further comment? Get what you needed.
I believe I do. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you, Kristen. Appreciate it. I think your presentations are over. All right. The next item under regular business is an introduction and discussion of the racially disparate impact analysis. Stephen Padua, our long-range planning manager, will be presenting tonight. Once Kristen yields the stage, Stephen can begin to give his presentation.
Hey, thank you, Chair Voice. Can you all see my screen? Okay. Oh, fine. Thank you, Commissioners. Tonight, we wanted to follow up with a discussion on the racially disparate impact analysis. When at the last meeting, we kind of introduced it as part of an attachment, as part of the proposal for amendments to several of the policies for the housing element. we wanted to follow up to actually talk through the RDI analysis, just so we have a better understanding of what it is, why we have it, and how we're using it, and how it's going to influence further updates to the housing element, as well as potential updates to other portions of the comprehensive plan. So a little background information on it. From House Bill 1221 was adopted in 2021. It required two major components for the housing element update. The first was we need to show how we plan for all income brackets. Part of the policy discussions that we've been having with the commission and prior discussions for the housing element amendments, as well as we need to assess the racially disparate impact analysis and how that's going to influence policy amendments for the housing element. The state has provided guidance for the RDI, and the first step is to engage the community on how to make amendments to housing element, and a lot of that it gets incorporated with the engagement for the comprehensive plan. The second and third step is actually the RDI report that was provided by our consultant for this update. And then the fourth and fifth steps is providing the revisions to the policies themselves and then having that adopted and regularly reviewed by City Council and the community over time, making sure that gets updated to the desires of how the community wants to see the housing element get updated in the historical context for the RDI. So what was highlighted is evidence that they found for racially restrictive covenants on properties they found in the city of Issaquah. But it doesn't paint the full picture of a lot of the racial discrimination that have been around housing throughout the city's history. And you all are, some or all of you are familiar with redlining as it's existed with housing in many of our communities around the nation. There's also been enforcement from the courts around racially discriminated covenants, from the Sanborn decision to enforce implied covenants. How many of you are familiar with this case law and what? Not seeing very many. So for the Sanborn decision, you basically got what were called implied covenants, in saying that a developer could enforce racially restrictive covenants on properties that didn't have it built into their deeds, as long as they enforced it in previous properties they developed with that embedded in the deed. So even though we found properties with these built into the deeds in 7 properties in the city of Issaquah, they could have been enforced in other properties in other areas of the city under this landmark case. So in addition to that, you also had neighborhood associations that were petitioning for many of these racially restricted covenants being built into these properties, as well as being discriminatory towards people who wanted to move into their neighborhoods who weren't of the same race. So in addition to the racially discriminated covenants that were found, you had all these other actions and events happening in that were systematic, pushing people out of neighborhoods in Issaquah and other cities. And this is something that is found in many other cities around the nation, not just in our region or even in Issaquah. So that's just something to put in context in terms of what we are looking at when it comes to finding any of this in our city, but also around the. And this is the exact language that was found in the properties. And those 7 properties were developed by one developer named Guy Harper back in the 1930s. The said property or any part thereof shall be used for the residence purposes only, and shall be occupied only by persons of the white race, except that of servants not of the white race, but actually employed by a white occupant, may reside on said premises. And you can, if you go through the source of the information in the RDI, you can find actually a map that the University of Washington has put together of multiple properties around the region that have racially restricted covenants built into the deed. See all the different types of language. This was what we were able to find for the city of Issaquah. The other piece of context I wanted to talk with a lot of this, in the map that was provided in the RDI, it shows with the citywide, those 7 properties in the southern part of the city. It doesn't really put into context in terms of what it really meant to the city or the town at the time. When you look at the city of Issaquah today, you are seeing a very vast community of 40,000 people, multiple businesses, a little more diverse than we used to be. At the time of when those buildings were built up in that upper area in the valley, that was the town at the time. And it was a much more a little more representation of what the perspective of the town when those developments were built within the town of Issaquah. So when you look at the historical timeline for when the city was developing and incorporated and becoming more of a city over time, you can find that similar to a lot of cities in our region, the city really developed in a time when the perspective, it was allowing a lot of these racially discriminatory actions and covenants being built. And so that is really the crux of the findings you see from the RDI is even though the city is very diverse, you only find a lot of that diversity in very concentrated neighborhoods within the city, showing that there is historical influence on how the makeup of the city has come together when you're looking at the older neighborhoods of the city not being as diverse as the newer neighborhoods that were developed after a lot of those racially discriminatory covenants were found illegal. So that is really what we're trying to show when we're looking at many of the themes that came out of the RDI analysis, is a lot of those historical decisions influenced the makeup of the city in terms of owner and renter households by race and ethnicity, and showing that Black and African American communities show a disproportionate amount of ownership. Same can be said for percent of all households experiencing housing cost burden. You find a little more higher percentages for BIPOC communities than for people from white communities. And when we are comparing renter households by income compared to rental units and supply, we have a disproportionate impact on in shortfall for many of the low-income residents within the city. This compared to the supply for higher income. And then that goes into the displacement risk of showing that this risk isn't necessarily high impact across all demographics in the city. Actually have a higher risk for the BIPOC communities that are surrounding the I-90 corridor and within central Issaquah and portions of Old Town. Yes.
I was curious about this map and wondered if the yellow, the part that's vulnerable, is predominantly rentals.
It is predominantly rentals. There are home ownership in this area.
I'm thinking about risk of displacement is very high with rentals, just because they're rentals. Yeah.
They are. But it's also, I mean, our regional growth center in Central Issaquah makes up predominant of this area. It is where we are expecting a lot more growth. So that really highlights the importance of a lot of the policy amendments that we're proposing with the housing element, to really highlight how and why we want to address displacement and cost burden communities within the city of Issaquah, and making sure that we are addressing that proactively and not waiting for it. Biggest takeaways I've been talking about tonight as part of this presentation, the demographics of the neighborhoods is strongly made up and influenced by a lot of the historical decisions and discrimination that happened around the nation. The displacement risk around Central Issaquah is moderate but high for Issaquah, and so we want to make sure that we take that into account with amendments for our policy. Cost burden households, we have a disproportionate amount of cost burden households for the BIPOC community, and we want to make sure we're addressing that and providing resources so that we reduce a lot of the people experiencing homelessness or the risk of people about to experience homelessness within the city of Issaquah. And then we also have a relatively high need for household supply for 50% AMI and lower. As was discussed with the regulations, we want to be able to plan for these communities, not just because of the targets, but also because of the actual need within the community. Any additional questions?
Thank you, Stephen. Questions, comments? Vice Chair Bader.
I have a comment, I guess, is that I really appreciated that presentation, and that was so much more compelling as to why proactive action is needed, in my opinion, than what is in this report. And so I would love to have more of what you said and kind of the color that you gave to why this is so important, and why the framing, in my opinion, that this report has of, hey, we're not as bad as everybody else, so yay us, and look at that little tiny red thing, right? We're fine here. It's not a problem, but actually it is, right? And so I thought that was a great presentation. I would just love to see more of that in this and in all city kind of policies and documents.
And one thing I would like to address, that was absolutely great comments, Vice Chair Bader, and the report that was put together by the consultant was really trying to meet what was required by the state in terms of providing the analysis. But in the discussions with the consultant, as well as just among staff, we are constantly evaluating a lot of these policies, as well as any of these regulations that relate to them, make sure that we have that full context beyond with what's just in that.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. I also think like this is a place where the city can say we're going to go above what the state requires us to do. We're going to name that this happened here, and that, you know, again, as well as you just presented it, I think that this is an opportunity to, you know, not to name it, right, even if the state doesn't require that.
Any other questions or comments?
Commissioner Altamore.
I just want to echo what Vice Chair Bader just said. The discussion last meeting really tied together the need for affordable housing for communities of color. This does such a better job of reflecting the fact that there is disproportionality in people experiencing poverty due to systemic racism, systemic oppression, all of the systems that are working together to create that, as opposed to the language that was used previously that was almost fault-based language versus the systems created over the last 100+ years. So I really appreciate that too. I think it adds a lot more clarity and takes away the stigma that I think a lot of the conversation was trying to get past last time.
Commissioner Samweta.
Yeah, and I agree with it, because in the sense that it gives understanding to why those numbers are the way they are, because it's based on a history of things. And you also have the aspect where you have that history, but you fast forward to present day, you have the BIPOC community, like the minorities and whatnot, who are still fearful of moving to certain areas because they've been in this I guess greater Seattle area for so long, and they've been kept out of certain areas. So that also limits that migration to areas like Issaquah and whatnot as well. So it's very nice to be able to see something like that. Like myself, I moved from somewhere else. I've only been in Washington State for almost 4 years now. So I wasn't privy to a lot of the history prior to that, and my ignorance was probably bliss. That's why I ended up in this great city and whatnot. So I'm able to tell people who are of my color how much I love this community as well, and I'll to promote this not only for people of my color but for others, because diversity brings understanding, and it also brings more love for humanity as well. So thank you.
Anything else?
Anybody else? Yeah, no, I'm going to echo my fellow commissioners. Stephen, fantastic presentation, and I do appreciate all the context, because I believe not last week, 2 weeks ago, some of that context is missing. Vice Chair Bader's point, a cursory reading of last week versus your eloquent and wonderful presentation does really expand it. It does really show and help. So thank you for that. I think the only thing that I found with the report from the consultants that I still can't is when they talk about the characteristics of the neighborhood, because it's been such a big part of our planning policy. So I don't know how you guys are going to square that. And I'm thinking of it more of the design element. I don't really know if the Leland Consulting Group, I don't know if that's what they meant. when they say they don't really like the language. But I know that language is what we've used ever since I've been here, and it's such an important, integral part to what people want. So again, and I'm thinking of more design, not thinking about, I'm not even thinking about like the affordability or any of those parts, because again, I think have a great presentation. I thought the Leland Consulting Group did do a good job. I think that's what I'm curious to see how the city squares that. Because as you well know, neighborhood characteristics is a big part of what we do. So that would be my only comment. Otherwise, appreciate the presentation.
You want me to address the comment, or?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, all right. So a lot of what we've been doing, particularly with the comprehensive plan, is more a tailored approach, depending on what the language intent is. We're really trying to be more specific of what neighborhood character means. And that's really where our consultant is getting at when their comments on neighborhood character can influence a lot of past racial discrimination. It's more of, we are trying to be more specific of what that means. And for each neighborhood, it's going to be different. And that could come through a neighborhood planning process. Part of those land use policies that we had introduced with this comp plan amendment was trying to find a way to define that for each of the neighborhoods. But for the broader policies that talk about neighborhood character and what was discussed at the last meeting, we proposed being specific and saying it refers to the neighborhood services and amenities that are meaningful for each of the neighborhoods. While still being broad, that is a little more specific in terms of what a lot of the neighborhoods really are looking for when we say neighborhood character. And so we were trying to be more intentional with each specific policy to make sure that we are being more specific on what neighborhood character is without being so broad as to reinforce a lot of the past harms that we are trying to avoid.
No, that's great.
Any other questions or comments? Okay.
Well, thank you, Stephen. Great presentation. 3 great presentations. We'll now move to reports, and we'll start with the city council updates. Not sure who's up, but I'm going to take a guess. It's Stephen.
It'll be me.
So, Stephen, if you could provide us any updates.
At
Please.
this time, we don't have a city council update, at least nothing new, but I will actually have a lot more for our next meeting.
Okay.
The one thing to update is we've updated this calendar for the commission, so the meeting on the 25th of April is canceled due to a conflict with the holiday. So our next meeting will actually be May 9th, and I'll be introducing you to a new member at that.
Always like new members. So, okay, well, wonderful. Any other business or announcements from staff?
Nothing from staff.
All right. Final word from our commissioners. Anything they'd like to add? Commissioner Millian, please.
I have a good of the order.
Good of the order.
Nobody came tonight.
Yeah.
And if they had come tonight, they would see how beautiful the cherry trees are down here at City Hall complex. And so anybody who's watching, please make a trip down to Sunset and see the beautiful cherry trees. They are at their peak. Wouldn't you say?
Absolutely.
Come on, wasn't that uplifting?
I honestly
as
thought you
came
were
in
going to
here?
say what a beautiful conversation we had. But then you said cherry trees, and I was, okay. Cherry trees are beautiful. Anything else? All right, well, thank you again, everybody, for coming this evening and participating. And we will adjourn this meeting tonight at 8:10 p.m.